I'm going to teach you how you can learn deeply and effectively just by listening. And for most people, learning to do this unlocks hours of extra time per day. Because imagine being able to understand and actually retain what you listen to when you are going for a walk or at the gym or listening to a podcast or driving somewhere, or if you're in meetings or lectures. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can learn by just listening through 3 key stages. And the first stage is pre-learning. And pre-learning is basically the stuff that you do before you start learning. So in this case, if you're about to go for a drive and listen to a podcast, pre-learning is the stuff before you hit play and start listening. These are strategies that prepare your mind to be able to learn and hold on to information more effectively. One example of this is a technique that I call intention setting. And intention setting is an incredibly powerful and super simple technique that you can use. It only takes like 10 to 20 seconds. You just ask yourself, what am I going to be learning and why? And the reason this simple strategy is so surprisingly effective is because whenever you learn any new information, that information comes into your brain. So let's say that this circle is your brain, and your brain is going to be looking for these connections and patterns between the different pieces of information that you're hearing. And if it finds a pattern, and if it's able to create these connections and form a network, the outcome of this is that we have that deep level of understanding and a high level of retention. Now, if we are not able to process this information and find these patterns and create these connections, then the natural thing that happens is that we just end up forgetting it, or our knowledge is very shallow. So this leads to forgetting. And so the quality of what you learn and how long you can retain it for depends on how effective your brain is at processing the information here in the middle. Now, a lot of people that I coach will say that if they're not writing notes, they can't learn. But this is not true. They just don't have the technique for learning through just listening. But the reason note-taking helps is because instead of trying to think about all this stuff only in your brain, which can be very overwhelming very quickly, by writing it on paper, it allows you to offload that. So your brain is less overwhelmed, which increases the quality of the processing, and therefore that increases the depth and retention. But note-taking is not the only way that we can make it easier for our brain to process new information. Another way is by prepping our brain so it expects a certain type of information, so it knows how to organize and connect it. Imagine you tell someone that you're going to give them a recipe for raspberry jam, and then you start giving them directions to the nearest library. This person is going to be very confused because they were expecting to receive information like a recipe. They were expecting to organize that information in a certain way. But now you're giving this other information that doesn't seem to fit. That confusion comes about because now their brain is trying to process this new information and figure out how it needs to fit. So by deliberately setting our intentions and asking ourselves, what are we about to learn and why? It means that as we are listening, our brain doesn't have to think so hard about how to organize it. It already is prepared to catch the information in the right way. Now we can take this a step further with a second technique, which is something I call prediction priming. To do prediction priming, all you have to do is say, I bet they're going to talk about XYZ. If you're about to listen to an audiobook on AI engineering, you might say, okay, well, I bet they're going to talk about these concepts and these topics. And by making that prediction up front, it actually makes it easier for our brain to process that information when we do hear it. The reason this works is because it forces us to examine the networks of knowledge we already have. It preps and primes those connections so that when new information comes in, they're ready to connect. And the best thing is, your prediction doesn't even have to be right. Just the process of trying to predict and then getting it wrong makes it easier to hold on to the information that was correct. This is called the hypercorrection effect. And because of the hypercorrection effect, it means that even if you're learning a completely new topic that you know almost nothing about, you can still use this technique because there's always at least something that you know about this topic, at least enough to make a guess. And the final thing that we can do in the pre-learning stage is inverted highlighting. When I was going through medical school and really getting deep into learning science, I found that my own understanding of learning science got a lot better when I started teaching other people what I was learning. And that's because it allowed my brain to focus in on what the key takeaways would be while I was learning it, because I would have to teach this to someone later. And that is what inverted highlighting is. Imagine you need to teach someone one big takeaway from what you're about to learn. And then you hold this framework and this mentality as you're listening. And the reason this works is that it activates a mental process called evaluation, which I know is just like a normal English word. But in learning science, when we say the word evaluation, we're usually referring to the process of judging how important a piece of information is relative to another piece of information. When we don't just focus on just trying to understand what we're listening to, but actually trying to make a clear value judgment on how important this is. Is it more important or less important than the previous thing that I heard? It actually forces our brain to think at a deeper level, which in turn helps our brain process it more meaningfully and therefore increases our depth and retention. So these are the 3 strategies that you can use in the pre-learning stage. But there is one more strategy that you can use that is incredibly beneficial. And that is to apply this process of evaluation and looking for importance across hundreds or maybe thousands of learning science research articles. Go through these articles and pick out what you think are the biggest takeaways that would improve your learning efficiency. Now, it will take you several years to do that, but it is well worth it because by the end, you can basically just coach yourself to be a better learner for the rest of your life. Now, if you don't feel like doing that, I have actually already done that for you and then packaged it into my free weekly newsletter. I've distilled through all the research and combined it with my experience coaching thousands of learners to figure out what I think are the heaviest hitting, most valuable principles to improve someone's learning efficiency. And I've packaged it into free weekly emails that go straight to your inbox. So if you're interested in checking that out and saving yourself a decade or so, then I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Now, after the pre-learning stage, we've got stage 2. This is the intra-learning stage, which involve techniques that you can use while you are listening. And there's actually 2 different types of techniques, and they're both just different types of breaks that you can take. The first is what I call an elaboration break. So here's how you take an elaboration break. Let's say you've done your pre-learning stuff, you've got your intention, you've done your prediction priming, you've done your inverted highlighting, we're all good to go. You press play and now you're listening to the lecture or the podcast. After they've covered a concept, you're gonna pause and take your elaboration break. At this point, you're gonna say to yourself, what you're basically saying is, and then you fill in the blank. Or another way you can say it is, so in simpler terms, this means blah, blah, blah. At a learning science level, what we're doing is we're saying that there is information that's coming in. And if I let that information pile up, I'm going to get overwhelmed. I'm not going to be able to process it. And therefore, my depth and retention are going to suffer. So instead of letting that happen, we're going to pause the information coming in. And we're just gonna let the brain process the information it's already got. We're giving it the time and the space to make those connections, to make sense of it, organize it, and file it away before adding on the next set of concepts. As you try to simplify it and as you try to summarize it, you'll also realize that you might struggle because you've misunderstood something, or you can't remember something, or you just don't know the answer. And so this is a great opportunity to either rewind and listen to it again, or if you can, look it up, ask AI. For a lot of people, they don't like taking these elaboration breaks because it involves you pausing and therefore it feels like it's just going to take longer to get through this material. But you have to remember, the point of learning isn't to get through material or finish a podcast. The point is to have knowledge in your brain that you can use and apply in the way that you need to make a real impact on your life. And so while pausing does slow down how fast information comes into your brain, it speeds up the actual learning that is happening in the brain. So that's the first break, that's the elaboration break. And then the second type of break is called a deload break. A deload break is when you've been consuming information for a long period of time, and then you feel like you're starting to get overloaded. You're getting overwhelmed. There are too many ideas floating around, and it's getting disorganized. You feel that knowledge is just gonna slip away. At this point, you are in what we call cognitive overload. When you enter into cognitive overload, your brain is not really learning anymore. There's no point taking in any more information. It will be better just to stop. And that's exactly what we do. We take a deload break where we pause, and we can either try to elaborate to see if we're able to simplify that information, make sense of it enough that we feel comfortable, and then we can consume a little bit more information and keep going. Or if we feel like it's just too much, then we just create what I call a station question. A station question is a question that allows you to get back on your train of thought. Get it? It's like a train station. You get on and off the train of thought. What this means is that when you pause, you ask yourself, what is the biggest question that I have right now? You're trying to create one or two questions that encapsulate where your biggest uncertainties are, where you think the biggest gaps in your knowledge are. If I had the answer to these questions, I would be able to make sense of this a little bit more and keep learning. But right now, I just do not have the mental capacity to figure out the answers to these questions. So you create these questions, but it means that when you get back into this learning, maybe 20 minutes later, maybe an hour later, maybe a few days later, you can answer the questions, and that helps you to resume your train of thought much more quickly. Instead of spending a long time trying to figure out what you were thinking about, what you were unsure about, and having to sort of rebuild your knowledge again from scratch. I really like station questions personally because it provides great closure on the train of thought that you were having when you were getting overloaded. But it means that if you only have like 5 or 10 minutes to pick up from when you left off, you can actually use that 5 or 10 minutes very effectively because you just answer the question and you're immediately on that train of thought again. Now, what happens if you're in a live event and you just cannot hit pause? Well, you have a few options. The first and best option is to force the pause by asking a question. This may not always be possible, but if you can, try to turn your elaboration break into essentially a question that you're asking. It gives your brain the same break it needs to just consolidate what it's consumed. Now, what if you can't ask a question? If that happens, you just need to keep asking yourself more station questions. And if you can, write down these questions. You're basically saying, I'm not really going to be able to follow this right now, but I at least want to document the types of questions I have so that when this is over, I can go through the questions and then sort through the information a little bit more there. And if you can't ask questions and you can't leave questions and you can't write notes during this time, then your only viable option is to sacrifice what you are listening to right now to prep yourself for what you're about to hear. You basically start this process again. You say, what I'm hearing right now, it's a lost cause. I'm going to have to come back to this later and pick up from it. But you don't want to get overloaded like 20 minutes into a presentation and then for the remaining hour, you're just like a dead fish. It's better to have a chunk of like 5 minutes where you completely zoned out, but you use that 5 minutes to prep yourself to properly focus on the next block of 20 minutes. And so you kind of treat that 5 minutes as if you're not listening to anything and you start from here again. Do your intention setting, do your prediction priming, do some inverted highlighting, and then get your brain ready to prepare the next set of information. It's not an ideal situation, but it's the best you're going to be able to do. So that was the intro learning techniques. And now we've got the final stage, which is the post learning. As you can imagine from the title, post-learning is the stuff that you do after you're finished listening. So after the meeting is over, after you've finished the podcast, whatever it is, this is the stuff you need to do to make sure that that memory stays optimum. So all information, when you learn it over a period of time, that memory is going to decay. And that's what the formal term for this is. It's called knowledge decay. Now, if you process information really, really well in the beginning, then your decay is going to be much slower, which means you just basically forget information more slowly. But even if you process information really, really well, your knowledge will always decay. Decay is sort of unavoidable. And so this is why we need to do something called retrieval practice. And that's the third stage strategy, which is to plan retrieval. Retrieval is the technical term for any time that you have knowledge and you're recalling it from memory. When you're just regurgitating a fact or explaining something, teaching something, answering a question, solving a problem, these are all forms of retrieval. And when you do retrieval, it also tops up your memory. It prevents knowledge decay. And there are 3 different ways that you can try to plan your retrieval. And you can remember this by remembering teach, test, or transform. And you use a different method depending on the type of information and why you're learning this in the first place. So teaching just means teaching this information to someone else. So plan something like a teaching session where you get to teach what you have learned from memory. The next one is test. When most people think about the word test, they think about sitting exams. Test is actually any time you try to recall information from your memory and see if it's right or wrong. So in a way, teaching is also a form of testing yourself, because as you're teaching it, you will detect if you don't remember something. You can also use something like a brain dump, which is basically just writing out notes or a mind map of what you've learned, again, from memory. Or, and this is a lot easier for working professionals, you can also test yourself just by using what you've learned in your daily life to solve problems. So in some situations, if you know what you are learning is directly related to the work that you are already doing, you don't need to even plan retrieval because you naturally will be retrieving this knowledge through your daily life. Now, the final one here is transform. Transform is a great method of retrieval for concepts that are really dense and really heavy that change the way that you think, believe, or relate to habits that you already have. So for example, let's say that you learn a new way of communicating or maintaining relationships with people, or you learn a new way of decision making. These are things where you already have existing perspectives and habits around. So changing these is often time consuming. You need to experience life with this perspective, trying to embody what you have learned for it to actually have a positive impact on your life. And so retrieving using transform really means asking yourself the question, so what now? I've learned this stuff. I feel like it's valuable. I feel like it could transform me. What am I going to do about that? What actions am I going to take, and how am I going to keep myself accountable? You don't want to end up in that situation where you've just heard like such a profound piece of information from a podcast or my YouTube channel, and then nothing changes. You've made no difference in your life. So retrieving through transformation means how are you going to make sure that you're acting on the new insights that you've gained? Those are the 3 stages for learning through listening. And if you do all of these techniques, it's not going to be as good as if you just had all the time in the world, you were sitting at your desk and you could write your notes and really learn it. But compared to how most people try to learn through listening, using these methods will dramatically improve your retention and how deeply you're able to understand what you hear. If you've enjoyed this video so far, then make sure to check out the newsletter. The link's in the description. And you might also be interested in checking out this other video here where I talk about some other learning techniques. Fun fact, I recorded this video twice because the first time I recorded it, the camera was out of focus. I'm so tired.